I felt the call of God on my life at various points in my Christian experience, from soon after I became a Christian and up to the point where I actually committed myself to Christian ministry. My dad discouraged me at various points, I think because he had had such a difficult experience himself. He wanted to be totally sure that the call that I had experienced was from God and was completely genuine. I suppose I've had a number of different careers. My brother-in-law says I'm a jack of all trades and a master of none. I hope that isn't entirely true. I've always been interested in how we think. And looking back, I can see that for some reason I had a particular interest in meaning and significance. I always wanted to do something significant. One of the reasons for my interest in biology was because of my experience of being torn between two worldviews. Going to school, and I'll show you a picture of where I went to school. There it is, Grange Farm Primary School in Coventry, just by this gate with the place where I would head first thing in the morning, and I would pick up the milk crates that had been left there and deliver the milk bottles to the younger children's classrooms, ready for their milk at break time. But at that school, I very soon became aware that there were different ways of looking at the world, and that the way that the school was looking at the world was quite different from the way that the world was seen while I was at home. At school, it was fine to blaspheme, and at home, it most definitely was not. Divorce was something that was increasingly and traumatically being experienced as a painful reality by some of my peers. And it's hard to describe this, but it's a sense of the fear of God was receding from my life. No guidance at school was given about human sexual relationships, and no teaching really about the importance of marriage and family life. And as I grew older, the pain of living in these two different worlds became stronger. This was manifested in a number of places. There were differences in terms of what could be done on a Sunday. And in the school, it was fine to have sporting events involved on a Sunday, and I couldn't be involved because Sundays were different in my family. Increasingly, there were tensions with regards to school assemblies and what was appropriate to be said and sung in those assemblies, and increasingly the sorts of books that should be read by children and young people. What was thought appropriate was very different at the school compared with at home. And so as I went to my first secondary school, and again, if I show you a picture of where I went. That's rather grand, but actually these buildings aren't where I went to school. You can just see the school. This is the best picture I could get, really. The school playing fields were sort of all along here, and we used to come for our cross-country run before starting our sports lessons up this road. I used to cycle to school. This first school that I went to, it's Blue Coat School in Coventry. I used to cycle there, and this is the little road that I would come down just approaching the school, and it would be just around that corner there. These are the playing fields that we used to play rugby on. And it was really going to this school that I decided that I had a good plan for sorting out this two-world tension. I would be one person at school and I would be a different person at home. And I even went as far as inventing a new job for my father. He was actually a pastor in a little nonconformist chapel in Coventry. And I invented a new job for him, which was a university lecturer. He had been a university lecturer in the past, but he wasn't one while I was at the school. I invented a television to be present at home, and there actually wasn't one there. And this led to all kinds of difficulties. I hadn't anticipated how difficult it was to live in two worlds, one of which was true and one of which wasn't at the same time. The problem with doing that is that the untrue world keeps on bumping into the true one. And this makes things awkward. And I was feeling that awkwardness, particularly on a Sunday. Interestingly, in the services at the little chapel, my dad would be preaching. This dad, who at school was a university lecturer in a imaginary world that I'd made my real world at school. Well, in the actual world, his actual preaching began to prick my conscience. This awareness of God, the God of truth, confronting me in this life where there was two different me's, two different people pretending, one of them pretending that they were the real and knowing that they weren't. Well, this was resolved to some degree when I changed schools. My parents weren't happy with the school that I'd gone to first, and I was changed to another school. And at that point, I had burnt my fingers badly with this idea of two different worlds. And I resolved that I would tell the truth and only the truth about my life. Very early in my life, I realized that one of the significant foundation issues was the issue of origins. If God made me, and if God made the universe, then that had consequences for how I should live. Is this world an unowned world? Is it a world that has nobody looking after it, that belongs to no one, that we just claim as our own? Or is it a world that has been made on purpose, and a world in which we have been given our lives to live? And really the question of, are we answerable to somebody as we live our lives? Does this world belong to somebody? Do our lives belong to somebody to whom we have to give an account of how we have lived? And of course, that does depend on where it all came from and where it's all going to. And this became a particularly pressing issue for me. I'll just put up another picture. When death came even closer into our family, I had experienced death prior to this, but this was the point where it became a pressing, close, imminent thing that had to be faced and thought about. So my eldest brother was a bit of a hero of mine, and he had a black Honda Super Dream, which I loved to go on the back of with him. He was a sort of larger than life character. He would go just for the sheer joy of it, playing his guitar and his harmonica out in the town, in the city. And I used to love spending time with Steve. And his life was suddenly terminated by a motorcycle accident. And this really was the thing that sparked me to start seeking God myself. And I had the experience of a Christian conversion at the age of 15. Now, this didn't resolve all the issues, and in many ways it was a painful and difficult time, and in many ways it sparked up all kinds of difficulties in my life and experience that I struggled with increasingly. About this time we moved down into Sussex, and I began my A-level studies in the town that we'd moved to in Crowborough. And I remember that we had to study for additional examinations called S-level examinations in biology and chemistry. And as a part of the S-level biology syllabus, we were told to read The Selfish Gene by Richard Dawkins. And that's I think that was well, it was that book. Whether it was that particular cover, I don't remember for sure. We were encouraged to admire Dawkins as a brilliant scientist and therefore as a writer to be trusted. And his accounts of scientific and material reality we were encouraged to take on trust. At that stage, I hadn't learnt to distinguish scientific facts from philosophical dogma. And reading that book, it seemed as if the very foundations of my whole life and thinking were being removed. And I was falling into a bottomless pit of meaninglessness and despair. And really the awareness of that pit has dogged me my whole life. It has merged with what I call my black dog experiences of mental darkness, and it has merged into the very voice of the devil himself. Well, I gained some relief at that time from three sources. First, by reading St. Augustine, The City of God. I used to go to the school library. I was a pretty lonely lad at that point, and I used to go to the school library and sit in the corner and read St. Augustine, The City of God. The second thing that was of help to me was the idea of entropy. And I would spend a lot of time thinking about thermodynamics and entropy. And entropy seemed to me to be tied up with the nature of time, so that time always flowed in the direction of increasing entropy, increasing disorder. And there seems to be no way to get the universe to go backwards. And this fascinated me. Yet we live in an universe that is not completely disordered. And there's clearly then a real beginning. And the idea of this beginning being at the point of maximal orderliness in the universe fascinated me. And it seemed to be speaking of something similar to the reality of God, in whom I could find meaning and purpose in my life. The third source of help was my love of biology, and especially the molecular aspect of biology. But this was the sort of thing that particularly interested me. This is the growing tip of a plant, and you can see the mass of cells, and particularly at the end, the red areas, the meristems. The cells are dividing there. These are the growing tips of the plant, and those cells, as they divide, they begin their lives as just like blank, empty cells. But as they grow and as the growth takes place, they gradually change and they become all of the different tissues of the plant. So some cells will become, depending on their position, some cells will become leaves, some cells will become the stems of those leaves, some might become flowers, some might become the bark, and so on. And this fascinated me, how that from those simple undifferentiated cells there could be all of this different ways of life coming out of that one cell. What was it that controlled these cells? What was it that determined their paths in life? This was one of the things that deeply interested me, and it seemed to me that these things, the realities of biology, the complexity, the stupendous orderliness that you find inside each living cell, seem to me speaking of things that could not possibly be mere happenings, despite all the assurances of the greatest minds of evolutionary biology. And this led me then to a degree in microbiology, specializing in cellular biology. And my first career then was in Sussex University. It was in this building. It was rather a short-lived career. I was working for a man called Professor Sidney Shell in the top floor of this building. I think it was, he told me that it was purchased, the building was purchased as a car park, because that was the cheapest way you could get the maximum amount of floor space. So they bought a car park and put stairs instead of ramps, and windows instead of gaps. Well, I worked up in the top floor here, and my work was on the to do with cancer research. We were working on whether a particular enzyme was involved in what's called homologous recombination in DNA. That is where there is a cutting and pasting of two pieces of DNA which are similar. So two strands of DNA are cut, and each end is pasted onto the other strand. And there's a particular enzyme that we were wanting to know whether it was involved in that process or not. It was called poly-ADP ribose polymerase. Well, this was a paid position, and I was hoping that it would lead to a PhD, but the funding came to an end after 2 years, and I hadn't done sufficient work to gain a PhD. And we just had our first child at that point, and I felt I needed a job with a more certain, more security. And so at that point, I did a PGCE. I became a secondary school biology teacher, and I taught biology in 2 separate state schools, the second of which I was head of biology. And then after 10 years of teaching biology, my career took another turn, and I ended up as the school computer network manager and head of resources faculty, teaching information technology. I'd been fascinated by information in the context of biology and DNA, and now I was fascinated by the way in which information was stored in an orderly fashion in what are called relational databases. Now, I mention these career involvements because, looking back, I'm convinced that a divine hand was involved in my interests and in my life journey. I believe I was being guided by the supremely informed informer, and God was interfering in the events in my life for a purpose, and he had a goal in mind. Well, eventually I left teaching and began to set up my own information technology company, focused on combining websites with databases for commercial and educational use. Now, during this period, God was working powerfully in my life. I was feeling an increasing pressure that God was calling me into full-time preaching ministry. Significantly, however, looking back, I can see that part of this calling to the Christian ministry was with regards to a sense of important gospel apologetics work, particularly to do with the way that language communicates information and meaning. It's hard for me to describe this, but it was a sense that within language itself, there was a sort of checkmate phenomena from God himself. I was personally feeling a sense of checkmate from God in my life, that he had moved his pieces in such a way that I had to acknowledge that he was calling me to the work of preaching. This was a thing that I had resisted before I was a Christian. I made a sort of vow to myself that I would never, ever become a Christian preacher and pastor. Well, God was having the last laugh, and he was working, and I had to acknowledge that he is boss, and that he was in charge, and that he could decide the direction of my life. And so at this point, there was again another rather abrupt change. Although looking back, I can see that it was in God's providence and in God's working. So at this point, suddenly, and in a rather inexplicable way, and rather out of character way, I switched from my interest in science and computing and information technology, and suddenly became fascinated with language, a consuming interest in language.